Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for our ARI Seminar on changing human behaviour to save species and protect our environment. I'm Tess McLaren, the Acting Science Manager, Knowledge as Behaviour and Science Impact, and I'll be the MC. I'd also like to introduce Penelope Jordan. Penelope will be sharing links and monitoring the chat for questions. Thanks, Penelope. So to start off, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land I'm joining you from, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I would like to extend that acknowledgement and respect to the traditional owners of the lands we're all dialing in from today. Today we have two excellent talks with a human behaviour and community engagement focus. To start us off, we have Dr Lily van Eeden from RMIT and formerly ARI, talking about the social dimensions of conservation and the role we can all play in protecting our environment. Lily's presentation will be followed by Dr Kasey Stamation from ARI, talking to us about the role the community are playing in protecting our endangered species through citizen science and behaviour change initiatives. We'll have time for questions after each talk, so please write them in the chat and we'll try to get to them after each talk. All right, let's get started. Over to you, Lily.
Great, thanks very much, Tess. Yeah, thank you for having me. My name's Lily. I'm currently at RMIT University, but as Tess said, I was previously at ARI for 3 years. I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on Wurundjeri country and grew up on Wurundjeri country. My research is essentially about human relationships with nature, and so my own relationship with nature and connection with nature was instilled through the time that I spent growing up on that Wurundjeri country. So I'm grateful to Wurundjeri people for managing and continue to manage that country for tens of thousands of years. And I'm trying to instill that same connection in my children, and here they are hanging out at a creek that I spent my childhood at as well. I'd like to start a bit philosophical, thinking about your relationship with nature. I want you to think about what your priorities are, what your objectives are when you think about what kinds of nature you want to have around you, what kinds of nature you care about, and how you'd like to see nature managed. So what do you want? I want to think about yourself, but I also want you to try and think about somebody quite different from you. So your next door neighbour, a distant family member, someone you went to high school with, someone who might take a different perspective on some of the things I want you to think about. So first of all, thinking about nature places in our cities. Would you prefer to have green manicured lawns with neat lines of European trees, or would you prefer something that perhaps looks a bit messier but is perhaps richer in the diversity of species that might have existed there some 250 years ago, like a grassland filled with native grass and other species? When you see these pictures, do you see lush green nature, or do you see invasive weeds? What kinds of management would you want to see in these kinds of places? When you look at these species, do you see on the left an iconic native Australian species, the dingo, or do you see an invasive introduced dog or wild dog? On the right-hand side, do you see brumbies? Do you think man from Snowy River, or do you see feral horse? And what kinds of management would you want to see, if any, of these kinds of animals? I hope from asking those questions, you might have thought about how your priorities and your way of thinking about these things is probably quite different to other people that you might interact with, probably those who are outside of your usual workplace. Essentially, I wanted you to think about conservation being about values. It's about what you care about. And values are cultural. We live in highly diverse multicultural societies, and so people will hold a diversity of values about their relationship with nature. Those values and the cultures that are embedded in the conservation that we practice is not static. It changes over time. And so I want this to be a bit of food for thought. Think about 150 years ago. That's four generations. We had acclimatization societies as Europeans were colonizing places like Australia and elsewhere around the world. They were trying to move species from their home country to these places that they were colonizing, and also move them around to the different places they were colonizing, trying to establish these species populations with the intention of improving nature for the betterment of mankind, I guess. So in Australia, lots of attempts were made. Not all were successful, but things that were successful were things like rabbits, hares, foxes, different species of deer, those things that have now become the subject of major expense and resources, trying to control them as pests in the environment, and to other interests like agriculture. Around the same time, we had policy and law in Queensland and similar in other places around Australia, like the Marsupials Destruction Bill of the late 1800s, which encouraged people to cull all marsupials, kangaroos, wallabies, koalas, you name it, in the name of achieving human values in our priorities for environmental management. So to us, that might sound crazy, and because only 150 years later, our priorities have been pretty much totally reversed, where now, by virtue of being introduced, we label species as inherently bad, and anything that has been here for millennia, we think of as being inherently good, with exceptions, of course. And that's not so much time. 150 years, 4 human generations. My great-grandparents were alive when we had acclimatization societies and these marsupial destruction bills. It's quite a big change in our culture about environmental management in a relatively short space of time. So why has this change happened? This is something I've been thinking about and reading about. I don't know what the answer is. Probably nobody knows what the answer is, but I'd say it's a combination of things. One idea proposed is that acclimatization societies started to fold for various reasons, including changes in Western scientific understanding. So Darwinian evolution, theories of island biogeography. We started to realize that humans had agency in shaping ecosystems. We started to see that we could make species go extinct. We could cause things like rabbit plagues, and people would have seen that firsthand. People started to change their relationships with local ecosystems as Europeans tried to farm using European ways of thinking in Australian ecosystems, and realised that didn't work. So we had to change what we're doing and start to appreciate the species that we'd come to know in Australia. As a European colony, a British colony, Australians wanted to start differentiating themselves from Britain, and so we employed our local flora and fauna in creating that identity. We put wattle in our emblem. We put kangaroos and emus in our national emblem. We started to see them with pride. And the other thing is just, I guess, around who has the decision-making power? What's the dominant culture at the time who shapes the way we make environmental management decisions? And reflected in that is legislation. Legislation is how we protect the things that we value. And so, that can be legislation's purpose, but also legislation's hard to change. So sometimes it can be a bit of a lag, and it doesn't represent necessarily what we value now, but maybe what we valued when it was written. One example of that in Victoria is the Wildlife Act of 1975, which, although it's seen some amendments in the last half century, it's essentially very similar to what it has been for that last almost 50 years, although it has been subject to a major review recently, and I think we're yet to see what that might mean next. But how the Wildlife Act of 1975, and that is our current act, defines wildlife is any animal of vertebrate taxon other than people, which is Indigenous to any part of Australia, all kinds of deer, non-Indigenous quail, pheasants and partridges, and basically anything else that the governor at the time decided we cared about. And then any taxon of terrestrial invertebrate, but only if it is listed as protected under the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act. So for us now, we might think that's not really how we typically think about protecting wildlife, but that's how it's written in the Wildlife Act, because that's what we were thinking about 50 years ago. So I hope from those last few slides, you can see conservation is both cultural, but also cultures evolve. Cultures are not static. We've seen rapid change in only a few generations. And at this point, it seemed fitting for me to acknowledge that my thinking in this space has been very much influenced by a project I've been involved in that's funded by the Cultural Evolution Society. So given that we've seen a lot of change in the last 150 years in our priorities, when I say our, I mean sort of the dominant governance structures that tend to be sort of influenced mostly by Judeo-Christian Western scientific thinking, tends to represent a particular subset of our culture, which may not be representative of that of the diverse societies that we live in. So we've seen that there's been big change. So we can only expect that we probably will continue to see big change. How we think about our priorities for environmental management now will be very different to that of our grandchildren or our great-grandchildren. So what do we want those futures to look like? I think if we can be proactive in thinking about the kinds of change that we want to see, that can be really helpful for helping to steer that ship with intention. And so I mentioned that to flag some work that I did while I was at ARI with some of my colleagues there, thinking about using future visioning processes to imagine an ideal scenario in, say, 100, 200 years. What might that look like? How can we think radically and break out of our usual sort of blinkered vision? We're thinking about whole systems. What kind of radical futures do we want to achieve? How can we do that in a way that integrates diverse voices? That was a priority for us in these exercises, and then we can map a pathway towards achieving that. So just want to flag that that's some work we've done. The references are available at the end of this presentation, but yeah, something that we've been thinking in the work that I was doing at ARI. So in terms of the things that will probably cause change in our relationships with nature and how we think about conservation, climate change is perhaps the most obvious. Of course, we know that there's rapid change happening in our ecological systems, and that will influence the way that we interact with those systems. Alongside that, as species are kind of forced to adapt and change their ranges, we're also moving species. We might reintroduce species that have gone locally extinct. We might move them to places so that they don't go extinct, as climate change means they can no longer exist where they were. De-extinction, when we talk about things like bringing back thylacines or woolly mammoths or other things that might have gone extinct. Rewilding, bioengineering, those things will all change how we think about where species belong, where we want them to be. Technology, we will expect people's values to change. I've been talking about cultures being about values. We might see increased human-wildlife conflict with a growing human population, with more competition for resources and space with wildlife. And the last thing I wanted to say on that is just if we do start to see a governance that can be more representative of diverse voices, that might mean different priorities for the kinds of things that we do. And I guess we're yet to see what that would look like. So as I've been trying to make clear, I think conservation is a cultural practice. It's about culture. What is culture? Culture is about values and behaviours. So values is about what we want, what kinds of relationships do we want with species, what species do we want and where do we want them. It may be informed by scientific evidence, but it's also ultimately about people, and not everybody agrees on what the right outcome should be, in part because of differing values. The other part of that is that it's about behaviours. So we know that humans can have detrimental impacts on conservation outcomes. And so sometimes we want to change people's behaviour to get them to stop doing something that might be detrimental or start doing something that could have a positive impact on behaviour. So we need to understand what those behaviours are and how to influence them. We might think of policy as being a behaviour change intervention. If you write a policy without thinking about human behaviour, you might limit how effective that policy can be. So that was part of the work that I was hired to do in my time at ARI, was thinking about behaviour change to protect nature. So many of you may be familiar with DECA's bioplan for 2037. So there is the one component of that that's about the biodiversity focus goals, and the other half is the part that is very human focused. So if you can't read the small text there on the left, the two goals for the Victorians Value Nature component are that all Victorians will be connecting with nature, with the idea that people connecting with nature will help them to appreciate nature, and then they may be more likely to act in pro-nature ways. And the other goal is to have 5 million Victorians acting to protect the natural environment. And so there are 5 groups of targets that have been set aside as priorities for this policy. One is to get people spending time in nature. Another one is focused on environmental volunteering. The other one is about being an advocate for nature and inspiring others to do things for nature. Nurturing nature at home, being about being pro-wildlife in your management decisions of your garden or your property, and being a responsible pet owner, which is mostly about management of cats and dogs to not negatively impact on the environment. So I was doing this work. I started in 2020, so a lot of what we were doing was online because of COVID. So what we've been doing is trying to understand what Victorians are doing. Who are our target audiences? What are people doing, and how might we want to influence that behaviour? So there's been an annual survey happening every year since 2018, seeking to sample a representative sample of Victorians. And by doing that, we can see what are the demographics of the different people who might be engaging in those different target behaviours, and how might that be changing over time. So there's a sort of the skeleton of that survey that will document what people are doing and how that's changing. But then each time we would also use, take an opportunity to collect some additional data thinking about behaviour change. So we would do that by thinking about it in kind of two dimensions. One, it's from a sort of individual behavioural psychology sense, thinking about the kinds of things that shape people's behaviour. So what are their beliefs about that behaviour? Do they think it's a good thing to do or a bad thing? What are the social norms? So that means what do you perceive others would expect you to do? What do you think other people in society would do? And whether you perceive yourself of being capable of engaging that behaviour. But of course, behaviours, people don't act in a vacuum. We're always influenced by the society and the environment that we live in. So you can also think about it from a multi-level systems perspective. So we as an individual are influenced by our relationships with other people. We're influenced by the environment that we live in, the structures that we live in, the infrastructure that shapes what we do every day. And so I want to go through a couple of examples of what that looked like in this work. And one is thinking about cat containment. So one priority was that we would encourage more people to prevent their cats from roaming freely where they might negatively impact on wildlife. And so thinking about this through an individual lens, we asked people what they were doing with their cats. And that was actually more complicated than just do you keep your cat in or not, because there are lots of ways that people might manage their cats that might might be something other than freely roaming. So whether they have access to a backyard they can't escape from, or they have a cat run, or they're allowed out but under supervision, there might be various ways that people's cats are managed. Basically, we found just over half of the people surveyed were keeping their cats contained at all times. We found that another third or so kept their cats contained at night, and then about 17% allowed their cat to roam either day or night. So more than half containing at all times is pretty good, and I imagine that's probably changed a lot over decades. But there was a social norm that people would contain their cats, that people should contain their cats. But what I think was the most interesting take home from this is that we found that cat owners did express concern that cats could impact on wildlife, but that didn't predict whether or not they contained their cat's movements. What did was about their concern for their cat. So for people who thought that a right to roam and be out in nature unsupervised, or even to engage in hunting behaviours, that was a normal and natural thing for cats to do and essential for their well-being, they were more likely to let their cat roam. For people who were concerned about their cat safety, that it might be hit by a car or attacked by a dog or exposed to disease, they were more likely to keep their cat contained. So this work was done in partnership with Zoos Victoria. And so I think what we found really enforced the approach that they take, where the emphasis has to be on cat welfare and not so much on the risks to wildlife, because that's not what speaks to cat owners. And so that's what their Safe Cat, Safe Wildlife program does. Yeah, so I think the take-home message for me was, for those of us who work in conservation, you can't assume that people's behaviours are shaped in the same way that you think. You have to try and put yourself in their shoes. And the other example I wanted to give takes both an individual approach, but also thinking about systems. And that was that we ran one of these surveys just after one of the lockdowns had ended in 2020. And we wanted to ask people about the time they spent in nature during those lockdowns. So we know there's lots of evidence that spending time in nature is good for your mental and physical health. It can be a good way to deal with stress. Obviously, it's good for exercise, but we know that we expected that people who had access to nature during COVID would have benefited from that. So what we did was we asked people during COVID lockdowns, do you think you've spent more, less, or about the same amount of time in nature as you would have prior to the pandemic? And we found that was roughly evenly split, with a third having spent more time, a third no difference, and a third having spent less time in nature. We found that women and younger people had spent more time in nature than they would have otherwise. Having your own garden or having access to urban parks was really important. Lachlan Francis at ARI helped me out with some spatial analyses where we looked at what area of remnant vegetation people had within their 5 kilometre zone. We looked at distance to nearest park, distance to nearest waterway or coastline, and it unsurprisingly found that people who had more nature in their local area spent more time in nature. But the thing that I thought was most interesting was that one strong predictor of whether or not you spent more time in nature during COVID lockdowns was whether you lived in a high or a low socioeconomic status area. So if you lived in an area of socioeconomic status disadvantage, you were less likely to spend more time in nature. And so these things are likely interacting, where greener places are probably where there is more money. But to me, it speaks to that systems level barrier of people being able to access those well-being benefits through accessing nature. Finally, I just want to summarize. I hope that I've encouraged you to think about nature being essentially about people. It's about our values. It's about our priorities. It's about our culture and what kinds of interaction we want to have in nature. What kinds of ecosystems do we want to promote? Inevitably, that culture will change. It's changed a lot in the last 150 years, and it will very likely change again in the coming century or so. It's about our values. It's about reflecting our values. Essentially, if we want to achieve our objectives that are shaped by our values, we need to understand people. We need to understand their values. We need to understand their priorities, their behaviours, and the systems that shape the way they engage with nature. So that's it from me. I've got a whole bunch of references here that include the work that I did while I was at ARI, as well as some other things that I'd like to acknowledge the team that I worked with while at ARI and my collaborators at RMIT and Monash, and also my collaborators who've been part of the Cultural Evolution Society work that we've been doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily. Such an important area of research and piece of work. If anyone has any questions, you can pop them in the chat. I see one from Doug about references. I think Penny will pop the link to Lily's publications in the chat. So if you're interested in reading some of the papers referenced in Lily's presentation, feel free to jump into those. I've got a question to kind of kick off the question section. What value do you see in embedding behaviour change in our environmental management going forward? This is obviously something we're kind of thinking about here at ARI at the moment, and it's what Kasey's going to talk about. But yeah, you're the expert.
Yeah, and perhaps I'm a bit biased here because this is the work that I do, but I feel that it's critical, and I feel that's why we still have a biodiversity crisis where things are getting worse. Obviously, it's not just about the broad public individual values. It's about the behaviours. It's also about the behaviours of people in major industry, the decision makers, the people that whether it's industry or in government. We need to understand how we get that change to happen. So I think it's critical. If you're going to design a policy or a campaign as an NGO, you need to understand who your audience is, what shapes them, what behaviours you need to be targeting, and how to meaningfully influence those people. I think it's critical to achieving real progress in conservation.
Yeah, I totally agree. Another question here from Megan. We need to manage for our values, but if our values are changing, how can we manage and make good choices for our future if there's so much change?
Yeah, and I would say essentially I don't have the answer, and it is a really complex thing. And I think around the world we're seeing people trying to find ways of doing that meaningfully. So there's Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity Environment, forget what the acronym stands for, but essentially that they've written this great big policy document about understanding diverse values towards nature. So, people's relational values, how people relate to nature, those everyday interactions you have, how your relationship with nature affects your culture, affects your relationship with other people. So it is really complex, but I think it just has to be starting with an ongoing conversation. How do we understand those diverse values? I think that's something we thought about when I was at ARI, is that for me personally, I come with a particular set of values. It's probably quite similar to my co-workers, but it might not be the same as the diverse multicultural societies that we live in. So how can we start to understand that? So if we can at least start understanding what we've got now, I think that's the first step to thinking about where we're going next, because we've got to start with something.
Yeah. Got a couple more questions. So Doug's wondering, so the way to get behaviour change, to get people to do the right thing, but is to kind of focus on their perceived self-interest. Is that kind of a good way of framing it, or is it more nuanced than that?
I guess it's context specific, but probably it does boil down to self-interest in some way. Trying to think of an example. It might not just be self-interest, but it may be more about, well, maybe this still does go down to self-interest. I was going to give the example of whether it's a behaviour or support for policy or management, and so there might be a behaviour associated with that. So let's say there's government proposes to do something and you don't agree with it. You might say I don't want that to happen, but you might not act on that. Whereas a behaviour associated with that might be, writing a letter to your local parliamentarian or attending a protest or whatever. So support doesn't necessarily equal behaviours. But just thinking about a few years ago, I spent some time in the US and doing some work on the sort of social dimensions of wolf conservation and management, of grey wolves in Washington state. And we did a survey where we looked at people's support for conservation and management of wolves, and basically found while things like your distance to the nearest wolf pack of where you live, whether you live in a wolf area, and your demographics, and whether or not you have family who are in the livestock production industry, those things are important. But the strongest predictor of whether or not somebody was supportive of wolf conservation was whether they voted for the Democrats or the Republicans. So sometimes your understanding of people's motivations for something, it might not seem to be connected to the issue. So sometimes it's about understanding the broader sort of underlying social values, social conflicts, and recognizing that people's support or engagement with a particular topic might be more about their sort of sense of identity and sense of the community that they belong in. So I guess I'm trying to say in a very long roundabout way, it might not just be their self-interest, it might be the things that they care about that don't seem to be directly about them. That was a long-winded answer, but
No, it was a great answer, and good to kind of highlight the your previous research that's looking directly at that as well. Probably got time for one more, and I thought this one was like a good kind of one to end on, is can we influence people's values, and if so, should we?
Well, the data would say that changing values is very different. It's very difficult. Values tend not to change. Deeply held values tend not to change very much, even over generations. So you'll probably hold values similar to your parents, and we as policymakers, researchers are very unlikely to influence people's values. It's more about appealing to people's values. So if people have values that are perhaps a bit more conservative, a bit more sort of economically focused, then you want to speak to them about an environmental issue in a way that appeals to their concerns about the economy or preservation of the culture that they care about. So I don't think it's about changing values. I think it's about understanding them and helping people to see how their values may align with the topic that's at hand. Of course, this is all kind of an ethical, is it appropriate to, it's kind of about marketing, right? Essentially what we're doing is, you might not want brands advertising you and manipulating you into buying something, but I guess we're kind of doing that as well, as we're selling an idea about what we value as conservationists. And so it is a complex ethical question about behaviour change. Are we getting people to do the right thing or what we want them to do as conservationists who have a particular idea about nature? Just to end on a philosophical note.
No, I reckon that's a great way to kind of finish that kind of complex but really interesting and hugely growing piece of work and an area of research, and something that I think is really important for us to factor in conservation across the board. So sorry to everyone who we haven't got to all those awesome questions. There's heaps of questions in the chat.
I'll try and write something in the chat.
Yeah, if you can, that would be great. But yeah, thank you so much, Lily. We're going to move on now to Dr. Kasey Stamation's talk, which is going to be focusing in on some more detailed aspects of our relationship and how the community are having kind of direct impacts and helping us with conservation. So showing that nature connection aspect as well. I'll leave it with you, Kasey. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so sticking with the theme that conservation is really about people, today I'll be talking about how the community are helping us protect one of our most endangered species here in Victoria, the southern right whale. So whilst this story is, showcasing the southern right whale as an example, hopefully the messages and the themes here can be applied to management of other threatened species. Hopefully it inspires further work and further community participation, not only in southern right whale research, but for other species as well. I acknowledge traditional owners' deep connections to sea country and whales across Victoria, including those of the Eastern Maar and Gunditjmara people in southwest Victoria, where southern right whales nurse and care for their young. These traditional owners have maintained strong spiritual connections to whales for millennia. So I wanted to start off the talk, I guess, with just giving you a little bit of a background on the southern right whale, why we care about it, why we can consider it as Victoria's own whale. So unlike humpback whales that will migrate further north to give birth, southern right whales are actually breeding and nursing their young right here in the southern coast of Australia and right here in Victoria. So in Australia, we have two populations. We've got a western population and an eastern population. I'll be talking today about the eastern population. It is a really very small population with only 300 individuals left. They are struggling to recover, so they were wiped out or almost brought to the point of extinction during the whaling times. Historically, the eastern population used areas right across southwest Victoria, Tasmania, and also New South Wales to breed. But today we only have one established nursery ground remaining, and that's at Logan's Beach in Warrnambool. So this is an area where females consistently return to breed. There are, we have got some encouraging signs of females using some other areas in southwest Victoria and also New South Wales in recent times. So it looks like they are starting to return to some of those traditional areas, but there's still a long way for them to go to get back to those pre-whaling numbers where there would have been tens of thousands. One reason, or there's a few reasons why the recovery has probably been very slow, and one is that they are very long-lived species, so they can live up to 100 years. They have a very strong site fidelity, so they've got this migratory culture that they pass down through generations, and they like to return to areas that they are familiar with. So if they are wiped out from an area, that cultural knowledge has been lost. They also have a very long calving cycle, so 3 to 4 years or sometimes even longer, which means long time between calves. One thing that makes southern right whales quite unique and special is that they have these callosity patterns on their heads that they are all born with. They all are a little bit different, just like a fingerprint. So when the whale is born, they have these callosities, which are just a hardened tissue. And soon after birth, whale lice that lives on the body of the whale will actually attach to these callosities. And the whale lice that like to attach to the callosities are bright white, which makes it really handy for us because it stands out in photos, which means if we have good photos, we can ID individuals. And being able to identify individuals means that we can learn a lot about the population, their movements, their individual life histories, as long as we have the photos of them. So that's where the whale paparazzi come into play. In Victoria, we're lucky to have a very strong whale watching community, very passionate people that care about whales and making a difference and spend hours on end, often in really poor conditions in the freezing cold, recording their sightings, taking photos and sending us that information. The department's had a long-standing monitoring program which goes back into to the early 80s, where staff would record their sightings and collect information from the community. But it really established in the early 90s when Mandy Watson joined the department, and she was really the driving force behind collating a lot of that data and images from the community. And this was carried through for decades, and we're still collecting that data today. So in 2019, we decided to streamline the process for the community to contribute their data, to make it a bit easier for people to get their data to us, and also easier for us to access that information. So we created this online platform called Whaleface. We have currently over 450 registered users. When you log into this platform, you can submit your own sightings if you have them. It's actually a really good place to store and manage your own data. So when you go in, you can see all of the data that you've submitted previously. So that data is always accessible to you. So it's a good storage place for your own data. There's also an image gallery. So when you upload your images, you can opt to have it displayed in the gallery so that then other users can see the photos that are coming in. We also have a map of sightings over the season, so you can look back at previous seasons as well and see where whales were being sighted. We also store our whale newsletters there. So during the season, we create monthly whale newsletters to keep people up to date with the season, and they are all archived within that platform. You can also subscribe to a mailing list to get those as well. So what happens to the data? At the end of the season, all of the data will be, all the sightings data will be uploaded to the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas, where it's publicly available, and it can be accessed by managers and researchers for conservation and planning purposes. We look through the photos, and the photos really serve two purposes. So one is to validate the sightings so that we know what species we have, that we know that it's a southern right or another species. But then we also look through the photos to see which ones we can use for photo IDs. And so what we're looking for there are photos of the callosities, and we will go through the long process of coding all of those photos and the callosities and adding them to our photo ID catalogue. So we have a regional photo ID catalogue called Seesaw Pick for Eastern Australia, and also the data is shared with the national catalogue. And once the data's in that catalogue, it can be accessed by other researchers, and we can look at things like connectivity between the other regions and develop regional population models. So the data we are receiving from the community is invaluable. It's really allowing us to better understand how whales are using the coast. More eyes on the water mean more information's coming to us, and we're really gathering a greater volume of data that we just wouldn't have the resources to collect otherwise. And I just want to give a shout out to Peter Reid, who's pictured there in that photo, diligently recording his whale notes. Peter's an amazing guy who has spent days and days on end recording whales. He actually started recording whales back in 2007 in the Warrnambool area, and he spends every day of the whale season making those daily recordings. It means that we've got this really valuable data set that we've been able to look towards for long-term patterns, things like arrival times and departure times and residency patterns of the breeding females. We've also been able to look at how calving rates have changed over time, and that chart down there is from one of our publications, which is actually showing that there hasn't been a significant increase in the number of calves born annually at Logan's Beach over the whole time that records have been kept. So while some years we will have higher numbers, up to 7 cow-calf pairs, Other years, like last season, we may have none. And if you look at it over a long period of time, on average, about 2 to 3 cow-calf pairs have been born each year at Logan's. But the population, there's no signs that that is the breeding population is significantly increasing there. We've also been able to piece together the life histories of breeding females. So looking at things like calving rates and calving intervals. So these are our regular breeding females at Warrnambool. You can see Wilma, she a special one. So she was one of actually the first female to be ID'd in the Warrnambool area. Our records in she has had 8 calves at the Logan's Beach over a 20-year period, and then because we were able to cross-match our images with the catalogue in South Australia, we found that she's actually now calving in South Australia at the head of Bight, and she continued calving there. She actually had a calf last year, and she's had another 5 calves in that time. So over a 41-year period, she's had at least 13 calves, and she's estimated to be around about 50 years old. Big Lips currently holds the record for the most number of calves at Logan's Beach. We recently discovered that she was around in the early 80s, so she's been breeding here for at least 40 years. So these are some of our younger females, or females that are newer to the catalogue. Some have only had one calf. We're still waiting to see whether these females will choose Logan's Beach as their regular calving ground. We are noticing that, particularly with the new females to the catalogue, that they are sometimes choosing other areas between seasons to have calves. And one example is M, who I'm going to talk about in a moment. She, in 2022, she had a calf in Victoria, but prior to that, she had actually calved once before in South Australia. So there might be a little bit of shifting before they actually settle on a location. So I wanted to share M's journey as an example of how citizen science is helping us really fill the gaps and understand more about how cow-calf pairs are moving around the coastline during the season. So M was first spotted at Logan's Beach on the 8th of July. She spent about 7 days moving around the Warrnambool area. So she didn't just stay in Logan's Beach, but she moved around the Warrnambool area for about 7 days. Then she was spotted at Port Campbell, where she sort of remained for about 10 days. And then after that, was spotted in Port Fairy for about 4 days before returning to Warrnambool, where she remained for another 18 days. So in total, she was around with her calf for 47 days on our coast. This movement, I guess, isn't as typical as what we've seen in the regular females. So often the older females will spend the majority of their time at Logan's Beach. And then as their calf grows, they start to do these swims. So they start to swim their calf around the coast, presumably getting them strong for their journey back south. But Em seemed to move her calf Squiggle, which was named by the local photographers. You can see in that photo it's got white squiggles on its belly. So she moved Squiggle around the coast a lot more than is typical. But I just wanted to show that this is really valuable information that we're receiving, that in the absence of satellite tracking, this is the next best thing, and it's obviously non-invasive. So since the establishment of Whaleface, we've been able to expand our reach across Victoria, and also the citizen science community as well have made connections. So our Whaleface citizen scientists have got connections with others in South Australia and Western Australia, and it means that we've got this really great network of people that are watching all along the Southern Right the southern coast of Australia. And it means that we're getting a lot more information about movements, and we're getting it much quicker than we normally would. And I just wanted to highlight this really important example of how this information can help manage situations during the season. So in 2020, a cow-calf pair was spotted off Cape Schanck by Barb Wallace. This calf was very small, tiny little calf, probably only days old, a long way away from any nursery ground. In the next day, it was spotted in Phillip Island, and unfortunately was getting a lot of attention by boats, which raised concerns, because this is a very small calf that needs time to rest and nurse, and it is quite vulnerable to disturbance from vessels. This pair continued to move, so they were then spotted at Portland in July, again sparking concerns, because there were vessels taking an interest in this pair. And then they continued to move. So in on the 16th of July, the citizen science community in South Australia photographed the same pair. You'll see that the calf is looking quite thin and has quite a lot of orange cyamids or sea lice, whale lice on it, which means it's probably not in the greatest conditions. So again, concerns were really high for this pair. They, against all odds though, they continued to move, and we got word on the 8th of August from Head of Bite that this cow-calf pair was spotted, and the calf was actually thriving and doing well. So it turned out to be a good story, but it really, highlighted how much we can learn from these observations. So whilst we learn a lot, it also raises a lot more questions. So obviously this female was from the Western population. She was trying to get to that nursery ground, and she's given birth en route. And I guess it raises the question of why did she mistime her run from the feeding ground? Was she spending longer there feeding for some reason? And also, how can we better protect these cow-calf pairs when this sort of thing happens? So whilst we know that we have a highly engaged and motivated group of whale enthusiasts in Victoria, we wanted to find out whether this awareness extended to the regular boating community, and if there was a way that we could motivate them to protect responsible boating behaviour around whales. So we surveyed recreational boat users, and we found that there is a low awareness of southern right whales. So only 32% knew that that southern right whales were breeding in Victoria. Only 23% knew that knew when they were most likely to see whales, and there was generally widespread agreement that better awareness would help boaters behave more responsibly during the whale season. So we launched a boating awareness initiative with 3 key messages. We wanted to model good behaviours, and we wanted to also foster emotional connections, which would hopefully lead to better boating behaviours and reduce the risk of vessel strike. So the 3 key actions were watch for whales, slow down, and keep a safe distance. And so we created multiple tools with these key messages, and we really also wanted to reinforce that these are our whales to protect. They're mums with babies that need our protection. One of the main tools was the temporary boat ramp signs. So these signs go out to boat ramps all across Victoria during the whale season. They're about to go out again, so we want them out there just for the whale season, so that when boaters arrive, they see these signs and it's a trigger to remind them that the whales are around. We also created engagement packs with lots of information in there that we distributed to local government, so local councils and other groups that are interested in educating their communities on how to act for conservation and better protect whales. So these include stickers and social media content, and lots of good stuff in there. So I'd also, I just wanted to finally, I guess, leave you with one more example of how the community are making significant contributions to science. So last year it was a quiet season. We didn't have any whales in Logan's Beach, and so we put out a call to the whale face community to look for old photos, especially of Wilma, because we were missing some photos from the catalogue of Wilma in years where we know that she was on the coast. Coralie Askew, who's pictured there, I just want to give a special mention to Coralie, because she spent hours going through old newspaper clippings in the Warrnambool Library, talking to people at the Historical Society, talking to people in the community, some people in their 90s, about their experiences with Wilma, looking at their photos. There was people came forth with scrapbooks and dive logs and all sorts of information. And we were not only able to find fill all of those gaps that we had for Wilma, we also found more information. So, and it was quite surprising. So we found that there were some females that we had in the catalogue already, but we hadn't had them join the catalogue until the 90s or early 2000s. But we found photos of them back in the 80s. So it showed that some of our breeding females are much older than what we thought, and is actually making us question, could this be influencing their recovery? So it's meant we've had to go back to the drawing board, and we need to create new models to account for these new sightings. So new population models are being developed that will include these new sightings and also try and account for some of the gaps that we have in the sightings histories. We are also trying to answer the question of whether age could be limited, the age structure of the population could be limiting their recovery. So we're collaborating with Emma Carroll at Auckland University, and she's going to analyse some existing skin samples that were taken back in the early 2000s. Now that we've got new molecular techniques that can actually age those samples, so we should be able to get some pretty good information on the age structure of this population. So that's all from me. I just want to leave you with a couple of QR codes. If you want to learn more, there is more information on the ARI website. You can download the engagement pack there too if you want to help spread the word. And you can join us by joining Whaleface and watch whales and make a difference. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kasey. And such a good way to kind of bring together the two talks by showcasing the nature connection and the contribution of the community. We've got a couple of really good questions in the chat. So we did have some pre-prepared ones, but I think we'll go with some of these. So from Danny, this is a fantastic citizen science project. Do you think that the personal identification of individual animals and naming them is a significant factor in successfully engaging volunteers through a more heightened emotional connection and response?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that definitely is a factor. So these, so the people get they do have connections to these whales because they are able to recognise them. They see them coming back every 3 to 4 years. They have their favourites. They know their stories from, something that, had happened last year. Like, there was one female that lost her calf, and then, she came back 2 years later and had another one, and that was, the community was so happy with, it was just such an emotional thing for them because they had watched this calf die, and then they've seen, you know, her come back and she's okay. So yeah, I think that being able to follow them through their life histories, to be able to name them, it really provides that extra connection.
Yeah, awesome. Another question here. So fantastic work, and fascinating, the project, the engagement project. Have there been any follow-up surveys on whether the signage and info packs have changed or improved people's awareness?
Yeah, great question. So we're about to launch a follow-up survey. So we will be tracking the success of the program. We'll hopefully do that every year for a little bit. So the first follow-up will go out fairly soon. And yeah, see what's working, how we can improve it. And yeah, we'll continue to do that.
Yeah. Time left, but I might ask one of the questions that we thought would be good to highlight as well. So how does this work complement the scientific surveying that you do?
Yeah, so the coastal surveys that we do answer slightly different questions. So and they also allow us to access areas where you can't access via land as easy. So there are parts of the coastline of Victoria that are inaccessible, and so if we are doing aerial surveys, we're able to survey the entire coast in these areas where you know, people might not be able to get to, so it helps fill those gaps. But there are some limitations with citizen science data in that it's not easy to quantify effort, and so if we're able to do aerial surveys consistently over a long period of time, it gives us another measure of population rate of increase that's a little bit more difficult with the citizen science data. But the citizen science data is collecting you know, filling those other gaps around the movements during the season that you wouldn't get just with a few aerial surveys. So yeah, they're different questions, but they complement each other well.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Kasey. And we're right on time now, but so we'll start to wrap up. So thank you everyone for attending, and thank you so much again to Kasey and Lily. Our next seminar will be on some of our invasive species. So it's called Oh Dear, Is Our Environment a Hog's Breakfast? And that's on Monday, the 13th of May from 1 to 2 p.m. So make sure you're signed up to our seminar mailing list, and you'll receive a link to the recording from this seminar, and you'll be able to register for the next seminar. Penny will pop the link in to subscribe in the chat in case some of you aren't already subscribers. And just also a reminder to grab any links you want to grab from the chat, because the chat will close once we end this seminar. And again, thanks so much, and have a lovely week, everyone.